Hello, everybody, and welcome to Pochtecaland. Today we have a guest with us, Sam Tamo, who's of Indigenous Roots Productions. And today we're going to be discussing about Indigenous topics based off of our experience. So Pochtecaland is a channel that where we promote the indigenous cultures of Mexico and the American Southwest. I'm Jonathan Rodriguez. My experiences, I have an anthropology background. I've worked and studied in Mexico and visited various archaeological sites and worked with different indigenous groups. I am currently based in Southern California, and so I will be in the ancestral homelands of the Tungva and the Serrano. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Sam, my guest speaker, to tell a little bit about his background and his company.
Hi, everybody. So, yeah, I am Shmuel Tamo Ana Suraya, or I am Assyrian. So, we are an indigenous nation of Mesopotamia who have been stateless for over 2,600 years. A lot of that has informed my experience and really the reason for founding Indigenous Roots Productions, which Indigenous Roots Productions IRP is a nonprofit collaborating with indigenous communities for oral history research films and folkloric music productions.
Excellent. Yeah. And so it was great to collaborate with Sam so we can talk about indigenous topics because a lot of people, especially in the United States, when we think of indigenous, we just think of indigenous people from the Americas, but we have to realize that there's indigenous people throughout the world. And due to colonialism, new types of cultures have interacted with others. And so we're going to have discussions about concepts about indigenous based off our experience. And Sam himself has had experience also working among indigenous cultures. So we're going to go ahead and, well, indigenous cultures in the Americas, I should have said, not just over in Mesopotamia, anything like that. So we're going to go ahead and start with our first topic here. Our topic is, what does indigenous mean? So our first question that we're going to want to talk about is, who is indigenous? So for me, I think this is very complicated because every country in the world is going to have their own category, their own definition of what identity is. And sometimes as countries, we kind of overlap each other or we kind of put our perspective over others. And we think that that's how it is throughout the world. So when we have these conversations, I think that it's important to first understand that it's very complex and we have to hear what other people's experience are. So I'll go ahead and turn over to Sam to see his input on it. And then I think a good example later on was I'll talk about the comparison between the United States and Mexico when it comes to indigenous. So what's your take on that, Sam?
Sure. Yeah. Well, kind of plugging what IRP does is always a listen first piece. And if we look at how indigenous people often refer to themselves, for instance, in Assyrian or Aramaic, Neo-Aramaic, Surit, we say Nashakamaya. That means first people. And even in Mexico, and other parts of Central and South America where I've heard Pueblo Indígena, I've also heard Pueblo Origina, right? And so we
Mhm.
think about original people, first people, and I think that a lot of what today in the English language we refer to as indigenous are people who may describe themselves as the first who lived in a certain land, settled in a certain land throughout the course of human migration and history. But why that word exists and really its meaning today in our social context, we think about post-colonial theory and this overarching label of indigenous affecting, including people from around the world who have variety of different cultures, a lot of major distinctions, even within their own subgroups or regional groups. So we think about why there is a word to describe all of those people and where that the source of that comes from, but then we also can think about the cultural connections amongst different Nashaqamai, our first people, what we now call indigenous people, and that in some reality there too is a reason that there is an overarching label that's not just based in post-colonial how do we say this, like miscategorization, right, of peoples, because a lot of indigenous people face similar challenges today. A lot of first peoples face similar challenges wherever they are and whatever their situation, whether it's political, environmental, or social changes that are affecting their culture. So we really want to think about that and how we ourselves view not just our groups, right, as indigenous peoples, but what indigenous means and how we can form groups together, which maybe I can talk a little bit more about that as the questions pop up and IRP comes up. But that's how I understand who is indigenous, what is indigenous. First, listen to the people who claim the identity and how they describe themselves, and then also really think about the source of those words and what they mean in today's context.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of this is really on experience because I think that over time, our ancestors, we all came from our ancestral homeland, no matter where it was from. But over time, migration has created this concept that, well, that was there, I'm different now, I'm not those. And that's understandable because that's how different cultures evolve. But the part that it seems like, or that people distance themselves, especially when it comes to recent areas in the world that have been colonized, like Latin America or Africa, is that sometimes there seems to be now a mixture, or that there's a different type of livelihood between who is indigenous and who has now become part of the mainstream. It's really ironic in a lot of times because who dictates what is considered to be mainstream or considers to be acceptable? In the case for Mexico, the mainstream is the mestizo, which is a label that was given to individuals who had mixed ancestry of European and indigenous. And this was during the Spanish Casa system. And so based off of what heritage you were you receive certain benefits based off of that, and it sifted throughout the time period. And so in a lot of ways, in order to prevent yourself being considered indigenous, a lot of people passed as mestizo to try to receive those benefits. And so over time, though, it seems ironic a lot because mestizos, even though that they're 50% or 50%, 50% indigenous, 50% European, in the eyes of that time period, the Spaniards who were born in Spain still didn't see them as the same. And this is what later led to a lot of the independent movements. And so even the Criollos, who were actually Spanish-born Americans, people that were born in the Americas but had Spanish ancestry, they weren't seen as equals to the Spaniards who were from Spain. So it starts creating this distinction. You can see that there's a separation of how classism starts working here, right? And so later on, of course, the mestizo population becomes the majority of the population in Mexico. It's ironic because we find that there's documents that the majority of the population of Mexico during the colonial times, despite 80 to 90% of the population was devastated by the diseases that were brought over, there was a indigenous rebound and it became the majority of the population, and there wasn't actually as many Spaniards that came over as what people may have thought. So we find that somehow, though, the identity shifted. And I think this was part of a way to try to become, quote unquote, evolved or be changing with the times. Because unfortunately, a lot of people think that being indigenous is something that is seen as in the past, but that is completely ridiculous. I mean, for a lot of people in Mexico, uh, to be indigenous, a lot of people think you have to speak an indigenous language. You have to live in a rural area. So there's certain traditions to carry on. And yet I'm thinking to myself, that's ridiculous when the Mesoamericans built cities like this in my background. That's Teotihuacan, which must have had maybe a population between 100 to 200,000 people, which would be one of the largest cities at its time. And so there's a lot of irony in this and how we interpret it and how we see it. But the biggest thing I want to also discuss is even today, there is a battle for identity because why is it that in mestizos are not seen as indigenous, but yet in the United States, certain people have to have a certain percentage to be called indigenous based off of each tribe's percentage and what their qualifications are. So it's ironic because if Mexico would follow the same standards of what the United States has, then about over 100 million Mexicans would be considered indigenous. So yeah, you can go ahead and take over from that, Sam. I just thought it would be very interesting to bring that up as an example.
Oh yeah, well that's all really interesting. Let me see if I can get to all the points that you had some great ideas. And one, the first thing that surprised me was hearing about Criollo because I hadn't really known about that except where IRP's current project partners are Nahuas of Alto Balsas, specifically from San Miguel Tequisiapan. And we are doing a project called Espiritu, which we'll talk more about later. But as far as why it relates, is one of the types of maize that they grow there, they call it criollo. So unless my memory is really escaping me, that was a strange and interesting connection for me, and I would be curious about what is the name for the history of a word? You know, I would really be curious how that word ended up being the name for a much brighter yellow corn they have,
Mhm.
while it also has the social ethnic context that you referenced earlier.
Yeah,
So
we'll
that's
have to look into the etymology of that. Maybe it was
right.
that is interesting. I'll have to look into that myself to see. So it's a type of species of corn, you say?
And the interesting thing, one of the main topics in Espiritu is about maize agriculture. And one of the main reasons is because the Rio Las Balsas there in the Alto Balsas region is really suffering from major contamination, industry-based and local community-based, that can be resolved, but that river and that area, according to paleoethnobotany, is recognized as at least one of the prime contenders, if not agreed upon as the champion for the domestication of maize over 8,000 years ago.
Oh
And
yeah,
so
absolutely.
now they are still practicing agricultural traditions dating back 8 millennia, and yet the irrigation is not necessarily from that river, and we might say in large part due to the modern industry changes that have affected the region, right?
Absolutely. And I
So
think that's another good point you bring up, is that indigenous groups throughout the world seem to be more targeted because they appear to be more easier to manipulate by certain policies or by certain companies that can take advantage of the situation. We see that happening a couple years ago. Forgive me for it was in, I believe, in North Dakota, that pipeline that was coming through there through the Indian reservation. Yeah, and so we see this happening throughout.
Standing, Standing Rock.
Was it Standing Rock? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And so you see this happening throughout, and people also, indigenous people tend to also be more conscientious of the environment. And so a lot of people think that, oh, well, to be indigenous, you have to be conscientious of the environment or think like this. But there's some ironies in that too, because I have come across some uh, indigenous cultures that are not as sensually attuned with it. So there's some flexibility that people have to understand that not everybody will have the same experience.
Yeah, and that actually gets back to some of the other points that you had that I thought of when you were speaking earlier, because even that you almost verbatim quoted what one Assyrian musician and composer and teacher in Chicago, Rabbi Rasan Bet Yonan, who is one of the narrators in Sights and Sounds of the Assyrian Diaspora. That's IRP's first research film. And he goes on to say that, yeah, he's talking about what does it mean to be Assyrian, and really that it's not because you go to a certain church, it's not because you eat certain food, it's not because you speak the language. Really, and another big part of that he doesn't explicitly mention is whether or not you're born in Mesopotamia. See, as a diasporic and stateless nation, a lot of Assyrians today, whether mixed like I am or full-blooded Assyrians, are born second generation, third, fourth generation in many of our host cities or host countries. So outside of modern day Iraq, outside of modern day Syria, Iran, the modern day Middle East or Mesopotamia. And that's a big part of even how we consider ourselves identity. But all of those still can't answer the question. It's much more nuanced to that
Mhm.
than that. Not just for Assyrians, but even more so when you start to think about indigenous communities around the world, and really how, again, back to how communities are defining themselves, what that means. And with the environmental piece that, you know, I've recognized now, and it was a bit ironic because our first film doesn't relate too much to the environment unless you're talking about geography and statelessness. But the Assyrian diaspora now is living outside of where our ancestors put their hands in the dirt, is living outside of where our grandfathers, even recent generations, were tilling that soil and raising cows and working that land and waking up there and having tea every day. You know, we're born outside of that. Our experiences are outside of that. And so how does that affect my connection, right, to the environment if I'm outside of my ancestral land? And we can think of this from an epigenetic standpoint, and just our let's say ancestral lifestyles really built into who we are, and yet those lifestyles aren't maintained because we're not in the same environment, right? And that happens to a lot of indigenous peoples. And so, however, our very next film had a lot to do with the environment. I'm really, our Nawa partners right now are on an annual cycle that cohesively and comprehensively ties in the environment. And when you think about a lot of indigenous languages, indigenous communities, they are so connected to their local environment that words are based on their specific plants, their specific types of rocks and animals that those words might not be found in other languages, right? So really their entire worldview is shaped by their local environment. And that, just kind of tying that point back, is when we are no longer living in our ancestral environment, what does that mean for our identity, for our human experience and perspective of the world? So those are all really interesting and deep questions. And I think that each individual indigenous person has to ask themselves. I do think that unfortunately there are some really strong emotions about what it means to be indigenous and who can claim indigeneity. I obviously think that there is a certain limit of respectful understanding that, these identities are built on generations of ethnic, cultural, and even familial connections that probably the integrity of those should be sustained as well as possible, considering one of the biggest reasons we're talking about this, the overarching elephant in the room, is that indigeneity and indigenous communities individually are not necessarily at the safest point in our history. So when we're thinking about needing to adjust and evolve with how our nations grow in this globalized context, just the remembering that we shouldn't be claiming anything that's not really ours, but also that it's not our place necessarily to tell people who they are and how they can identify about their generational heritage, and especially maybe even making slurs for people who, for instance, are born outside of the community or don't know the language or don't necessarily adhere to all of the accepted individual community standards. That we can't really say that doesn't make a certain person in our community a part of our community. And honestly, I don't want to open that whole can of worms, but then you get into how those strict identity confinements are self-placed, self-imposed by indigenous communities, oftentimes as a response to the trauma that they've experienced that has deteriorated their culture so much. So it's like, whoa, we've gone through now centuries, if not millennia, of whether it is statelessness, displacement, what kind of persecution, and all of that social interactivity over the course of many generations ends up creating this new cultural viewpoint or societal viewpoint of our community. And then now, to be considered one of us, you have to stick to that.
Correct.
Okay, well, there's something there to talk about, but also just let's jump back before those traumas and think about our ancestors and how accepting they were and how they understood, and how even, I think a lot about Assyrian kings who were definitely not only marrying and having children with Assyrian queens. So I know that this is a part of the human experience to learn about other cultures, diversify, and appreciate. Today, in the assimilation-based globalized world we are, it's a little bit more of a sensitive topic for a lot of indigenous people because of what we've lost so far.
Absolutely. And I think that some ways how we can relate to this, or that we can give more examples, is that if we see among the Mexican American community who has been here in the United States for generations, and you can even trace it back further because of the indigenous ancestry, is that you see that over time that there has been 5 generations in the United States. These individuals have lost how to speak Spanish. And so their cultural awareness to Mexico is no longer there. And is that really their fault? You have to think about that. And the truth is that, yeah, they could have gone to Mexico or taken Spanish classes. But the truth is like, you have to realize it comes within the person of what that person's experience is. But you also mentioned about the trauma. throughout history, we've seen that Americans have been marginalized, and even the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was supposed to protect the Mexicans that were in the remaining, that were in the former Mexican territories. Their lands, their citizenship was pretty much in question throughout the early part of the 1800s, even all the way to the 1960s. And so you have to realize that this is what drives or push people to kind of forget about traditional their traditions. And even though technically, even Spanish itself is an example of this, because Spanish isn't a native language of Mexico. It is now part of the culture of Mexico. And so put this as another
I wanted
example
to
of,
ask you a question about that point, but that's one thing that I've realized in our project. So just for a little brief background, Espiritu started, we were looking for a translator for a separate project, and I was in Mexico the beginning of 2024. And we found a translator who was going to help us out with, and has helped out with that project from Nahuatl to Spanish. But then, when going on pre-production and meeting that translator, we, just long story short, built some really good rapport with IRP's roots phase and pre-agreement package, and ended up building a project really based on the on our partners' uh, community and educational efforts so far. I think actually they just defended their dissertation like this past month, so. Then came home, did some grant writing, and then went back to Mexico for another 3.5 months, living with our partner in San Miguel Tequisiapan, a Nahuatl village on the edge of the Rio Las Balsas that I was talking about before. So just a little bit of context for that, because as we were there, obviously I was completely immersed with our partner community, and on a daily basis made a lot of contacts and made a lot of friends and met a lot of people and had a lot of conversations that caused a lot of reflection about this, for me, a new indigenous community and culture that I was learning about at a deeper level. And one of the connections between Nahuas and Assyrians is diaspora. And really, again, back to that, why this overarching label? Is it post-colonial, or is there something to that? You've got southern Mexico indigenous communities facing the exodus from the homeland. You've got Assyrians of Mesopotamia facing the exodus, have been, right, for a while, and completely different reasons. In Mesopotamia, often, especially as Christian, Assyrians are largely Christian today, and just being an ethnic minority, it's a violence issue, right? But either way, the end result is that people are no longer living in their ancestral homeland. In southern Mexico, especially where we were, I can speak to that part of Guerrero, it's not necessarily violence that's driving people away, but economic pressures, which is just as, just as valid of a reason, because at the end of the day, the same consequence occurs, is that indigenous people, are no longer living in their ancestral homeland. And so what do we think about when we're seeing that pattern happening to indigenous people literally across continents, and how we know it will affect the loss of language, the loss of culture, the loss of identity, the assimilation, and obviously the loss of those lands, right? And so just when I was there and I was thinking about that, and I realized that some of the people from San Miguel de Tequisiapan who grew up Nahuatl in a Nahuatl village speaking Nahuatl before Spanish, and then moved to the United States, and they're not considered Nahuatl here, they're considered Mexican. They're not expected to speak Nahuatl, they're expected to speak Spanish. And so now it's like you have another layer there of identity questions that, for instance, why am I so passionate about this? My own youth and the questions that I face. And you think about the youth, who we do see a lot of family immigration. We do see a lot of indigenous peoples who are wanting to provide the next generation more security, right? When we think about the economic pressure. And so what happens to those youth that are raised in a society and a culture that not only doesn't accept them as Mexican, maybe, but also doesn't even acknowledge or is aware of their indigenous identity, whether it's Zapoteca, whether it's Nahuatl, And yeah, it just really had me kind of in the feels about that, because that's tough. That's tough, because all the while, you're also still just having to like be a normal kid and try to figure out who you are in this big world and what the people around you are like. And so I can understand that the questions of identity and why we're talking about this are hopefully we can reach some indigenous youth who can think about this question in new ways and maybe give themselves a little bit of leniency with some of the social emotional pressures that we've been talking about can be placed on community members depending on their specific identity circumstances.
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned it, it's economy. People have to make a living. And it's not necessarily that something happens new. I mean, this has happened throughout history. We've seen migration stories even before the arrival of Europeans. The famous one is the Mexicas or the Aztecs that migrated from Aztlan down to central Mexico. They did that out of economic necessity, in a sense. The stories
Which
that their god.
doesn't that even make this conversation more unique and interesting about Mexico? Because isn't that where the name Mexico comes from?
Oh, absolutely.
And,
People
and so
forget
even
that.
the name of the country in this modern geopolitical system does have its roots in indigenous culture
Well,
from the region.
you know me, I'm the first one to say that Mexico has an indigenous foundation, and people forget about that because a lot of people think that, oh, Mexico started in 1521. It didn't exist before then. And people don't realize is that that's actually what the Mexicas called their area. Some people argue saying it was called Anahuac, but we have documents of Mexica accounts of them actually referring to themselves as the Spanish actually referred to the Mexicas as Mexicanos,
Right.
and they called their capital Mexico Tenochtitlan, and they also have their sister city Mexico Tlatelolco. So there was already that concept of Mexico, and a lot of people don't realize that. And I guess over time, people think that, oh, this was a Spanish influence, but it's not. You literally find it, and you realize that there is a lot of this indigenous influence. But unfortunately, over time, we see that these driving factors is what pushes kind of like a separation or a loss of what the origin is. Going back on the migration and how we've seen the economic impact of it, we see that even currently in Sinaloa, there is the Mayos or and under well, the Mayos are in Sinaloa, and so they're being pressured. They are, even though there's about 40,000 Mayo speakers, there is a estimation that their language is critical. And the reason for that is because of an economic drive to learn Spanish or English so that their youth doesn't value that. And that is a major issue. How do you preserve your language like this? And the same thing can be said for, we're mentioning about the economic driving factors. NAFTA was a huge driving factor of how many people from Oaxaca shifted and moved up. Not even Oaxaca, also Chiapas. A lot of people were migrating to the United States because of NAFTA. And so you have people like the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs and the Mije who are migrating to the United States out of economic necessity. But when these individuals go into the United States, does their language pass on to their children? In a sense, is it the same how Europeans came to the United States and how they eventually lost their languages? And so it's unfortunate that a lot of this gets lost and it becomes part of what is seen as mainstream or become Americanized. But the difference is, and you can see people arguing this, is that a difference between the European countries and a culture like Mexico is that Mexico is nearby. Mexico is close. The American Southwest has a Spanish, Mexican, and Native foundation because there was various cities that already were established by these communities. And so when people think that, oh, there was nothing here, no, there was populations that were here. And yes, it may not have been at large what you guys may think about, but the fact is that there already was something that when the Anglos came over, they built upon those sites. So the foundation, Mexican influence is part of the United States. That was something that was inherited after the Mexican-American War. So it's really interesting. And even like New Mexico, they're really proud about that Spanish ancestry. And that's a whole interesting conversation to get into because that's a whole other identity to talk about. But we see that there is this driving force that makes people kind of separate themselves from it. And it's unfortunate because do these people ever go back to their homeland? And it cannot doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's indigenous. We go back to Mexican Americans. And there's a popular term now that's being used. It was originally they were called pochos, But over time, that term has changed over. But now there's the no sabos, which the younger generation are calling people that, oh, you don't speak Spanish, you don't know Mexican history, right? And so, it comes within that individual if that individual wants to learn what their experience is. So now people are getting pressured. And this is how people sometimes use it for their advantage or their disadvantage. And they try to approach it on how they can live like their identity. Do they have identity crisis? And that's the problem that people have is that some people don't experience the same things and they think that in order to be a certain culture, you have to live this certain way. And sometimes that's not always the case. Even in
Well,
the
and
United
here,
States,
here's the thing that I want to make sure that especially indigenous people understand about that. When you have that mentality and when you spread that mentality, I hope that you can understand there are some indigenous people who would love to maintain whatever you think they should be doing, but they don't have that opportunity. They don't have the access. They don't have the language skills, or their grandma wasn't in the same country, so they couldn't learn the food. They don't have the community around them to build a worship place or a church. So when we're expecting these things of people, for them to be considered not just like our friend, right, but a member of a specific indigenous identity, and they can't necessarily for factors beyond their control. What does that say about ourselves and our community's character? And I think that that conversation is a pretty widespread
there's
understanding.
a little bit of stereotyping in there, isn't there? Like, in order to be indigenous, you have to live this certain way. And if you don't, you're automatically like kicked out of that label.
Well, I mean, and I kicked out like those. That would be a very impassioned person. But even sort of rejecting or being hesitant or qualifying people's identity because they don't adhere to the indigenous expectations that you have. Well, I, unless you are still in a community in your ancestral homeland that has changed a drastically lesser amount than for instance the whole spectrum of indigenous evolutions into the modern age, then I'm not sure that you should really be saying anything because you're gonna by consequence that means that you're a part of an indigenous community that has evolved, that has changed, that
Exactly.
everybody is not living the exact same way,
Exactly.
and not only as they used to but as they are right now.
And I think that's a pressure that a lot of Mexicans have because if Mexicans, the average Mexican has around 50% indigenous ancestry, why can't they say that they're indigenous? I get it that they can't say that, oh, they're part of one specific tribe or like one part of culture because that time has passed on or that they've lost that connection anymore. But to bring up the fact that you are indigenous allows you to have a better appreciation for the land that you are from. And so I think that it gets more pressured because of that idea that, oh, being indigenous is something different. I've had friends who are from Nahuatl communities, and they tell me that they wouldn't be considered indigenous because they don't speak Nahuatl. And it's funny because they also told me that because I live in a city, that I'm not considered indigenous. So it's so ironic how there's all these
Okay,
outside
so perfect
factors.
example, right? Perfect example. Assyrians today, the amount of Assyrians living in rural Assyrian villages today, I don't want to just throw a random number out, but as far as that compared to the amount of Assyrians living in major cities throughout the world, I mean, goodness gracious, it's you talk about Sydney, Melbourne, Chicago, Montreal, spots in California, Detroit, even London, cities in Sweden. There are the largest Assyrian communities. And even when you go to Iraq and you're talking about in Baghdad versus in Nuhadra or in one of the northern villages in the northern plains, there aren't really too many indigenous community or at least Assyrian communities rather that can claim to be maintaining the same lifestyle. I will tell you this, maybe even as far as like 100 years ago, right? Because you think about us, we faced two genocides slash some people call massacre, but two genocides in 1915, 1933, and then you have the recent invasions of Iraq and what's happened in Syria. All four of those events aren't just like a few Assyrians leave. entire regions leave the area. They are no longer in their ancestral lands and they are no longer practicing. Where do they go? They go to cities to get protection.
So it's
So
really out of it's out. It's,
and that just to finish my point though, and that's why I really want, if there's even one indigenous Assyrian who may be a bit more judgmental than we should, and I am speaking and defending myself because like you, if you expect somebody to adhere to that and yet they're not the reason for the genocides. They're not the reason for the forced displacement. That individual that you are judging or not accepting isn't the reason for the diaspora. And yet, because they're suffering the consequences of it, you're gonna keep them out of your group, like your ethnic group
exactly.
out of it. That's very arrogant and
Yes.
ignorant.
I have come across that too. This is another interesting question. Is like it's important that number one, we have to continue these cultures to continue it within the future generations and appreciate all the cultures around the world. But we have come across certain individuals that are very protective of their culture, and we understand why. But then you have some people that are very exclusive and don't want to bring in other outsiders. But you realize that unfortunately, this is how some languages die. So sometimes you have to find a balance, finding people that you can trust to bring into the community. For example, the Yaqui culture of Southern Sonora, their story, how they were the first, they were like really the only culture that really stopped the Spanish advancement after the Aztecs. Because
Well, and Purepucha, I've heard that about them too.
well, so when these Aztecs were defeated by the Spaniards, the Purépechas actually, there's actually a story that the Purépechas were thinking about sending enforcements to actually assist the Aztecs, but that never happened. But when that happened, that when the Aztec Empire fell, the Purépechas actually were fearing what was happening. They actually welcomed Hernan Cortez into Michoacan. But what happened later is that there's this horrible conquistador by the name of Nuno Guzman, who comes into Michoacan, devastates the whole area, and he actually tortures the king of the Purepecha because he's demanding gold and all this, and so he actually gets killed, the king, and so Nuno Guzman is pretty much running his own show, and so he continues his advancement all the way through Nayarit, Sinaloa, Jalisco, I forgot to mention, and he's devastating the whole populations there. All right, and so he later gets charged for his crimes and atrocities because he literally went on slave raids. That was one of his goals, and that's why a lot of populations in Nayarit and Sinaloa were devastated by the old world disease and by the conquest. But after Guzman gets turned in, his nephew continues his tradition, going exploring into southern Sonora. The Yaquis were actually the first to actually stop the Spanish advancement because it ended. The story goes like in 1531, a Yaqui chief put a line in the sand and tell them not to advance anymore, and the Spaniards didn't agree to that, and a whole battle ensued. And so it took many years for the Spaniards to actually come back into Yaqui territory, or they try to avoid it. But when the missions come, the Jesuit missions can't come into Sinaloa, northern Sinaloa, they took a different approach and they actually worked with the indigenous people a lot. And so the Mayos were one of the first. And so they were introduced to that. And so when the Yaquis heard of that, they actually allowed the missioners to come into their land, but they didn't allow the conquistadors or the Spanish settler to come into their territory. And that is how the Yaqui community started to become the 8 Yaqui pueblos of the modern day. So they adapted on their own terms in that sense. So that's part of evolution, in a sense, is that how these traditions become part of time. And to this day, the Yaquis remain as one of the few tribes never to be conquered. And that is because of their resilience and their adaptation. So adaptation is indigenous, and people forget that. People think that, oh, you can't, they don't evolve. That's a complete misunderstanding. It's a falsehood that people have, because everybody in the world, we're here today, we all have adapted some way or another. All right. Another thing too is, well, we can talk that about another topic later. But I was going to mention about how we all are mixed also, because people try to have this superiority complex over everything that they're purebreds, but that's a separate conversation. But that's important to mention how there's this adaptation, and people forget that. People think that, oh, they don't, or that they can't learn their ways. And so that's a big issue that I've come across. But I think that when you are able to work with people and understand how to approach these topics, you have to find a way how to adapt, and that is how your cultures survive. So, so there's a lot of other examples, but I'll go ahead and let you take over on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been touching on a lot of different ideas, the importance of challenging purity claims because of the negative impact they can have on sense of belonging. And maybe I haven't honed that point around just too much, but again, earlier I mentioned epigenetics, and I've talked about my focus on youth experiences of indigeneity, for example, maybe especially in diaspora. And when it comes to the understanding of the evolution of people's identity, really please just recognizing the constant continuity and transformation of indigenous cultures um, in a globalized world, aside from situations which, what you mentioned about the Yaqui, that at least could be a good example for this. But honestly, that's not the comprehensive history of the Yaqui. It could be that they wouldn't apply for this type. And I'm not sure that there are too many, if any, more indigenous tribes, nations, communities that can claim to have not been affected by globalization, which in turn means modernization, which often in turn means westernization. And so we all understand, and we would prefer that the purity of our indigenous cultures was able to remain, that there weren't tons of borrowed words in languages that are 5,000 years old, that there aren't people who are struggling, for instance, maybe to find members of their community to connect with in a family building way because they're in diaspora. I mean, these are really difficult situations that happen not necessarily because of somebody, and especially not because of youth who are trying to figure out their identity, but they've happened over the course of centuries and millennia as a result of a complex series of events that we try to categorize as this idea of globalization, but really it wasn't just one group, it wasn't just one process, and we have to focus on what we do have now, and that kind of ties us back to what you were talking about, and if I didn't say it already, what I love and am excited for about IRP is our focus on oral history research in modern indigenous communities. I mean, there is still a ton of research and studying of ancient indigenous communities, what we might consider that to be. However, the people who are alive today and maintaining their heritage, and that's probably really what the final point that I'd like to get on when we're talking about the judgment that might come, or the societal pressures that might come from within our nations, remembering that if somebody is trying, if they are doing their best, if they are if they have any resemblance of a right to claim the identity and they are doing their best, then just recognize that, support your community members, welcome them in, bring them in, help with language courses. And if you're that passionate about it that you want to try to define who is considered as a part of your community, then you better have organizational volunteer time. You better have something community work oriented to back up what you're saying, because ultimately, if you're worried about and responding to the changes that are happening in your community, and you think that the preservation efforts could be increased, then be a part of that and take
Right.
a step forward. I think that's important to say.
Yeah, I think it's very important. And also it's, you know, studying anthropology, I've come across people who claim that, oh, you're studying a white man's institution, right? And it's interesting because I understand that there is some hesitation there, because how does the history get interpreted? Because it's all up to interpret. We didn't live 500 years ago, so we're basing
Well,
off.
let me challenge that, because the word is yes, and the processes that have been used traditionally, yes. But the notion that a field of study, meaning something that humans got together in their culture and their society and decided we want to look at this more deeply, the idea that that is inherently Western, or a specific field of study would be inherently Western, maybe some, but I don't think is always the case. I think that we have to understand that different communities would have their own version of seeing the world and how people interact and what and how our psyche and experience as individuals relates to our broader environment. I mean, I don't think that's a strictly Western mentality or global view to have, right?
Yeah,
So
these are of course smaller populations, or I'm just mentioning how some people come in and question that because they haven't had that experience, right? But I have to remind them that there are indigenous communities that are sending their own members to colleges. So they themselves are understanding that they have to learn and get with the times, and hopefully that they will bring that knowledge to their community to only grow it better. There's even moments where indigenous cultures, complete different cultures that have mixed together and have shared ideas. This is no different. That's the whole thing. It goes back to mixing. You know, uh, Everywhere in the world is a mixture of people because of our ancestors that mixed with other tribes over time. It's just that over that time that it becomes a generally a distinction of another culture. That's really what it is. Unless maybe you're the Sentinel people off in the Indian Ocean that have still been isolated for so long. But the reality is that that's part of every one of us. Evolution is within us. And I think that when you do have that mixing of cultures or mixing of ideas, it does help your culture continue and improve upon itself. Not saying that it is perfect. There's moments where it goes horribly wrong. The beginning of it is bad. And you still have to understand that, for example, Messi Sake was terrible. It was tremendous. It was horrible on the indigenous population. But the survivors of it had to adapt. If they didn't adapt, then they would not have survived. So that's the point I'm saying, is that it's unfortunate that this happens, but the miracle of it is that the adaptation and the resilience of individuals to learn and move on and carry their tradition on is very important. I think that's what people tend to forget, is that indigenous people have gone through this before, and they will continue, and they will continue to survive and continue to be part of this world. And people continue to think that, oh, you're completely they're completely separated from society. And it's like, they're not separated from society. You have to realize that society has also ignored them too, because of these distinctions, that people don't want to interact with them. And in turn too, so that people can understand this concept too, is that it's not just indigenous people that are mixed too. Europeans have mixed with each other big time as well. The whole royal families, they're all mixed with each other. So you have, the English royalty mixed with the German, the
sure.
Spanish mixed with the French, et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing happened in Mesoamerica, because a lot of the Aztec royalty was actually mixed with other Nahuatl cultures as well, with the Acolhuas, with the Tepanecas.
Yeah, so
Go ahead.
there we're talking about Crenshaw's intersectionality, because I mean, ultimately, yes, every individual is going to have a collection of different experiences based on the cultural mixing, like you're talking about, that lead to that individual. And then one word that I was hesitating to use before, because I think that can be that can connote the reason for a lot of pushback from indigenous communities, is hybridity, right?
Yes,
So ultimately, though, and that's the point about I was making about globalization. I mean, it is, we are in 2025. There have been cultures, at least according to our conventional historical timeline, we're talking about cultures that could date at least as far back as 90,000 years ago, with Blambos Cave and the ochre paintings there and symbology. But if that's the most generous we can really be with the evidence we have, 90,000 years of culture, and eventually, when the world is globalized like this, there are going to be connections across cultures that you just will not avoid. And
correct.
there is, I also will, I don't want to push too far on one side of the balance, that, yeah, That's why I started IRP. I mean, we want to preserve, we want to amplify, we want to provide or collaborate to create better economic stability and opportunities that allow for the maintenance of indigenous cultures. We want to stop genocide. That's not up to one organization or even
And
one
people forget a
generation.
genocide doesn't have to be about people passing away or
Well,
dying.
so
It's
yeah,
also
because
there's also
I,
cultural
I,
genocide.
I'm sure there's better terms. Maybe somebody has coined. I call it physical genocide and then cultural genocide.
Yeah,
And
there you go.
always, 100% of the time, physical genocide leads to cultural genocide. Period. Whatever. I don't. No matter what, if you murder a group of people to a certain point, and because they are that group of people, the effect that that has on the community from actually losing those cultural bearers to the resistance of the people who experience that trauma to claim their identity.
Mhm.
Well, most humans, yes, if they are told because you're this, we're going to mutilate you and your family, they would stop saying that they are that. That's a really big act of faith to ask someone when we're talking about warlords, we're talking about governments, we're talking about major industries that are uh, at the front lines with communities that yes, are not equipped with physical defenses to protect themselves in the way that a modern system, creates
Yeah,
it.
these are marginalized groups that get ignored and people take advantage of them all the time. And so I think that, with globalization, like you mentioned, we're coming across similarities between different cultures. And I think that it's because we have this idea that, oh, because it's a separate race, even though race is a man-made concept, that it's something that is completely foreign to us, right? Instead of us realizing that we're all humans and we will see that we have these similarities. We all love, we all have
Yeah.
activities, we all have traditions, and we tend to always want to look at the skin color, at the differences before the similarities. So I think that as globalization continues, it really started, technically it started as soon as, Christopher Columbus landed, I would say. But could you also
Oh,
go
the
back to the
entire
Silk
age of
Road?
exploration. Yeah.
It's been around, but the huge push for it, or when it was really large, where it started growing, was, I would say, in the 1990s really started. But it's now we're seeing that because of
Well,
the
let's say
internet.
20th century. 20th
Yeah,
century, with the rise of major marine transportation, the rise of aviation, and then even like major train systems like across continents and stuff. Once all that really occurred within that 1900s, and once those happened, people's access, so that's the thing, right? 1915, 1933, Assyrian genocides are happening that we really reference a lot today. It doesn't mean that massacres didn't happen before that, but in the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, if I'm an Assyrian in northern Iraq or southern Iran, and my community is facing raids from other nomadic groups or from radical religious groups, yeah, I want to protect myself. I'm going to do my best. But like, how easy is it for me and entire villages to leave and completely
exactly.
uproot and go somewhere else and take what we have and actually make a home somewhere else, And so then if that same situation happens, but okay, if we can get a bus to the city, there's a train that'll take us far. Oh, if we can get a bus to the city, we can get a plane ticket now and go to
Correct.
Europe, right?
And
So then it starts to just
yeah, and with the rise of internet, and we see through social media, information goes by a lot quick now. It goes quicker now. We can get it instant. Whereas before, people were still didn't know about other areas in the world. So now we
oh,
have
that's true
this
too.
idea of we have
That's
a
true.
greater broad of what the world is. And like you said, we have better transportation systems now and communication systems. So there's more of a insurance that we can make it, whereas in the past it was very difficult. So these are all, we can all see how this all ties in with indigenous people, and we can see that I think that with globalization is that it will only come to us I'm hoping that it allows us to appreciate our cultures even more because it brings more awareness of everybody. And thankfully, because we're in the digital age, a lot of these traditions and languages can be preserved. I'm hoping that we have community members and we have academics that can get the funding for that. And that's a whole other talk about, but that is extremely important. And it's important for us to also recognize where our ancestry is from. I think that we kind of substitute it now with DNA tests. But I my issues with DNA tests is I think they kind of simplify it too much. And you hear me, I think it's better to always first hear it from your parents and grandparents. I feel sorry for those who didn't have that opportunity because their ancestors or parents or grandparents passed away where they can't find out. But the issue is that I think
The
that
language barrier.
oh yeah, absolutely too. And I think that with it also brings that there is this misconception that if you grew up in a community, you're going to adapt to that community. But if you take a DNA test and you find out you're like 25% Irish, does that instantly make you Irish? Culturally, no. You have the ancestry of it, right? But that's the issue is that, and then you can, don't get me wrong, you can go back and you can, now that you know that, you can learn about your Irish culture, right? But the issue is that now it creates a your connection from your parents. If you don't have a parent or relative, do you lose that connection anymore? Because now you're trying to understand it differently. I also think that there is some issues with how these organizations are interpreting the data because they're able to tell, for example, there's some organizations that are able to tell apart between a Spaniard and a Portuguese, but yet they can't tell apart between a Zapotec and a Nahua, because Spanish and Portuguese, they've been in the Iberia Peninsula for thousands of years. There's obviously cultural mixing there. So that means in Mesoamerica, if the Mixtecs and the Nahuas are part of two different migration stories because they're both two different language families. But if you take the average DNA test, they include this all as indigenous Mexico. And, there was other studies we find out that Mexico has one of the most diverse indigenous DNAs because of all the different migrations that came to Mexico and settled there. It was, they even say that Mexico once had the most languages, well, actually had more languages spoken than all of Europe before Christopher Columbus settled in the Americas.
Yeah.
So I think that brings
Europe
us,
had already started colonizing its own indigenous peoples.
what's that?
Because Europe had already been colonizing its own indigenous peoples from
Okay.
Rome.
Yeah. So that's another thing too, is that it's funny how we don't see that also, is that Rome was also technically the foundation of modern European society. And we don't realize that Rome also conquered indigenous people as well. Because there actually are the Gauls in France or like the Basques in Spain.
I mean, once you start looking at the diversity of Germanic tribes or the Druids or,
Mhm.
yes, the Basques, all the different indigenous groups that we know of, I'm telling you, within those groups, they will have even further distinctions for themselves, including language, right? All
Mm-hmm.
the Germanic tribes and the various clans of those tribes are not going to have the same, not only language, but even dialect. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, that claim itself, and once we start to, what we're doing here is acknowledging that because a lot of colonization and imperialism came out of Europe, we often turn our attention about oppressed peoples or marginalized peoples such as indigenous peoples to the I don't like global south either. We got rid of third world and I don't like global south like
Mm-hmm.
underneath either, but to developing areas I'm settling with that are outside of what's considered the West. And I think that sometimes that can even mean like losing our attention for the indigenous peoples that face their demise way before we were having this conversation to
Right. Yeah.
exclude certain peoples. So when the Romans and then even the British start to really lock down their language systems, city systems, political systems. We can say that European indigenous culture is Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the numbers on that would be, but whoever said that Mexico had more languages, like maybe they're not thinking far back enough about Europe.
Mhm. I think that the thing is that I think that we tend to think it seems like there's more of a distinction that we're able to call out from certain European cultures, but not so much as indigenous cultures in the United States or like in the Americas, I should say. Because if you ask the average person, name me five native groups, how many of them are really going to? Because a lot of people think like natives are just all one people, and that's true, but there's different cultures, and that's what separates them apart. No different than a French person from France and an Italian. People tend to forget that. And so I think that when I was going back on the DNA test, is that we kind of umbrella it all. We kind of don't realize the diversity of what the Native Americans were. And the same thing could be said in Europe, that there was a lot of diversity of different Germanic tribes. And I think that it's up for interpretation, a lot of this DNA is, or simply that they haven't had enough um, examples, enough blood or not DNA tests submitted from these certain regions. That's something that I could investigate more so on, but that's something that
Well, so this we're on a great point about that intersectionality piece by Crenshaw that I wanted to that whenever I was writing notes for this talk, I realized the thing, and this happened with me, and I think I'm seeing it actually happen with a lot of different not just Assyrian but indigenous youth or next generation leaders or people who are really interested and invested in their traditions and identity is that our diverse backgrounds and experiences and neo-colonialism happening still today, right, are all causes for indigenous resilience and reclamation. So sometimes elder Assyrians, just speaking to my individual experience, have explained to me that one of the reasons I'm so passionate about and can, for instance, speak better Assyrian than some people who are raised in a completely Assyrian household, even though I didn't learn it until I was 19 and I went back to Mesopotamia. That I've done so much research on Assyrians specifically, even made the first film for Assyrians. I have shirts like this and wear them proudly, and they explain to people literally all over the world about who we are and where we come from. And I've been told that the reason for all of that is largely probably because I've had to scratch and claw for my identity. Being called here in Arkansas in the 90s Mexican or then terrorist, and really nobody knowing what Assyrian meant. Being told Assyrians don't exist. That's a real big part of my story as far as the identity challenging piece. And moving forward to who I am now and how that's pushed me and driven me, I think I see that happening as well. Some of the Nawa students that we interviewed are taking extra classes after school day, getting tutored on learning their language because maybe their grandparents didn't speak it as much, or their parents found that pressure for their kids to learn better Spanish so that they can get different jobs and economic opportunities. But the younger generation, the more that they, when they see a ceremony held in the local village, or when they hear or see about a local scholar like our partner in the area, a female leader of the community, and all the involvement they have that individual has with the language, with the agricultural tradition, with the ceremonial tradition, and the youth see somebody like that, have somebody to look up to, and they want to learn more, and they dig back for it, because otherwise all day they're looking at the same YouTube and Instagram nonsense that we can all get tired of. But in reality, they see right before, some are able to find now this beautiful golden nugget of culture that they belong to and that they get to reclaim at a time when, and that's again really, yeah, that I strongly believe in what IRP is doing, not just because I founded it and it's a super fun job and I love working with our partners, but because of that point exactly. We have opportunities today to amplify our stories, amplify our cultures, connect our people around the world. These educational and documentary outreach systems don't just have to be limited to a single indigenous community. They can expand multiple indigenous nations, and they can bring families together that are living across borders. So we're thinking about transnational ways of using our time and day and resisting the post-colonial structures, the challenges to our identity, the phenotype and colorism requirements in this new world of globalization, and saying no. Instead, what we're gonna do, we're gonna make the most of it, and we're gonna show our beautiful cultures, our traditions, and we're going to make sure that you can see and hear our voices about the challenges that we're facing because of these post-colonial and capitalistic corporate-based systems that are really controlling the world, our environment, and our various global our entire global heritage in a sense.
Absolutely. I mean, we both know that history isn't for everybody, or maybe they don't want to hear the cultural breakdown of it. But when we have academics or people that get involved in these organizations, they should be able to be heard because they're the ones that are on the front lines, understanding these cultures and understanding that it's not simple. I think that the average person, we want to simplify things, and we don't realize that if a person is from another country, they could be an ethnicity from that country of many other ethnicities. So people tend to kind of use their nationality as like their total identity. But people don't realize that within these nations, there's other ethnicities that are part of its country's histories and their identity. So I think that, for example, it's a weird thing how growing up, people, they would say that people would ask me, "Oh, what am I?" Or like, they were assuming I'm Mexican, which they were correct to have Mexican ancestry, but they'll be like, "Oh, you're Spaniard," and then I'm like, "Well, I have nothing to do with Spain. I don't have no parent, I have no relatives, or I don't know anybody who's from Spain. Spain was in Mexico 300 years ago, and New Spain is not the same as what Spain was back there. And over time, these 300 years, they become completely culture separated, right? And at the same time, too, that indigenous ancestry that I have, it gets ignored. Or people think that, oh, Mexicans aren't indigenous, but yet it's
Well,
weird
yeah,
because historically, Mexicans haven't been seen as the same as white people because back in the late
right,
1800s, they
right.
were seen as Indians. They were
Yeah.
seen as mixed people. And over time, they kind of became white. And then at times, they have been seen as segregated. And people don't realize that there is this complex history behind every culture out there. We just have to take the time to understand and break it down.
So yeah, and because of your questions and preparing for this, I was really happy because it turned me on to Jose
Oh,
Vasconcelos and
Vasconcelos.
uh,
Yes.
Mistaje ideology, which is a lot
Yes.
of what you're talking about right now. But this myth of racial mixture as a national identity and what that means as far as all the distinct Mexican indigenous identities and how mestizo really reinforces that colonial hierarchy that not only are we not recognizing your individual identity, but we're going to put a specific label on you that ensures you are distinct even from us, right?
Exactly. So, for background on that,
Othering.
that was after the Mexican Revolution. And
Okay.
so, for people that don't know, the Mexican Revolution was extremely influential for Mexico. It was the reason for it was that Porfirio Diaz, who was originally a hero of Cinco de Mayo, he eventually becomes president of Mexico after Benito Juarez passes away in 1872, I believe. And he helps mobilize the country into modernization. He funds infrastructure projects, brings in railroads, brings in foreign companies to help extract resources. But this is the issue: is that he eventually turns into a dictator, and he eventually uses the people of Mexico as laborers, and they get taken advantage of. All right. And even the indigenous people are targeted during this time. And it's ironic because Porfirio Diaz himself had a grandmother who was Mixtec. So it comes to this idea. And during this same time is ironic because they're praising the Aztec Empire, but they're not praising the modern day indigenous people. And you'll
Oh,
find
yeah.
this a lot is that they see indigenous people as a way of the past, but yet they're still honoring like the Aztec Empire or the great Mayan civilizations.
Well, and I'm sure in Mexico too, there have been definitely not in the way that the U.S. and Canada have done it, but there was also a lot of negative view of indigenous peoples here because the systemic systemic food system, alcohol system, gamble system, and lack of infrastructural system that was really maybe more than just coincidentally ended up that way, but even intentionally, right, placed on indigenous reservations here in the U.S. And I don't mean to offend by saying maybe. I'm just keeping an open mind with my language, but as we can see it through historical records, really quite an intentional means of suppressing success within
Correct.
indigenous populations and how those reservations were set up, making sure we remember the foundation for all that is that it's a reservation for certain people to live on the land that they already lived on, unless they were moved away to a different part of the land. So it's already kind of a messed up situation with the
Oh yeah.
reservation, but then with how the liquor stores and convenience stores and subpar educational systems that were provided from the outside. And I'm not speaking to what certain indigenous nations have been able to do for themselves, which, of course, however, a community's elders deem their pathway to be best for the community, then that's great. I'm not speaking to that. I'm speaking more to the institutional and governmental infrastructure that was set up or not set up for reservations. So then what does that lead to, right? So then that's led to outsiders viewing indigenous people as alcoholics. Indigenous peoples aren't alcoholics. You just stole their land, you took their families, and you gave them nothing but liquor stores to use their low wages on in this area that you forced them to live
Right.
at. Right? So it's
So
like that. That's that when those outsider viewpoints of indigenous people are held, that indicates just the overall lack of actual reflection and understanding that a lot of your average, in the example I'm using, people from the US, in your example, your average Mexican might have for indigenous people, not understanding the systemic challenges that the community or the individual is and have overcome in their life and in past generations to still maintain this culture that's ages old in spite of all the marginalization. And so when we have these viewpoints of indigenous people as you say, part of the past, or as alcoholics, or anything in between and beyond, that it's difficult, because the first thing I would say, and maybe the only thing I'd say, is please look deeper into the situation. But unfortunately, I'm afraid that a lot of people who might have that opinion maybe aren't willing to look deeper into the situation to understand it more clearly.
yeah, so from my view of it is that people don't realize. See, the thing is that in the United States, it was actually straight up like Anglos versus natives,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But in Mexico, it's ironic because you have mestizos that are fighting against natives.
Yeah.
So it's really like it's like if the
And
mestizos could actually
and
see
that's
that
so
they're
huge,
fighting
Jonathan.
themselves, because
Oh my gosh.
the Europeans, the Spaniards didn't see mestizos as the same. And so during the 1800s, during the Porfiriato, during the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, he's promoting not only European investment to come in, foreigners to come in and invest in Mexico, extract its resources, also Americans are coming in. And so they're seeing that European identity is the way to go. All right. And this is what kind of leads up to the Mexican Revolution, because the indigenous people and the undermixed people that are still not at that same level as the higher class mestizos, they fight against the Porfirio Diaz administration, and Porfirio Diaz goes into exile. And so after the Mexican Revolution, there's now to embrace indigenous identity. And this is why you see a lot of murals by Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo during this time, how it's promoting that. But here's the other irony of it. The Raza Cosmica started to promote that we are mixed people and we should be proud of each other. So it's in a sense that that idea kind of still ignored the indigenous people because now you want to be mestizo.
So okay, yes. So everything you're saying, awesome, and it's given us a chance to bring up these two really relevant pieces. We think about Benedict Anderson's nation state theory and the idea that of a state defined narrative of indigenous identity, and so we're starting to get how that relates to the conversation a bit, understanding Berger and Luckman's social constructivism and how communities decide who we are. We think about how certain communities decided that they are going to identify as mestizo in as a consequence of this history that you're explaining, and the powers that were also determined that some people would not be mestizo, but they would be considered indigenous. And what connotation would that have then? As we have our mestizos, at least there, maybe I'm just saying the small print here, but like the idea is the mestizos are at least somewhat connected to us. They have a little bit of our blood, but then there are those indigenous peoples, and
Mm-hmm.
then really what we know, the implied social hierarchy is that the Europeans are of course superior, right? And so mestizo gives this like bridge to not only separate and discontinue certain people's indigenous identity in Mexico, but it also then pulls some of that social capital and the cultural influence back towards the Europeans and the Spanish influence while leaving the indigenous completely behind the isolated groups.
Yeah. And so that is what happens. And so we see that a lot of these indigenous groups, though, the adaptation is remarkable because you still see that there's indigenous groups that are still surviving. And Nahuatl, even though it was devastated by the indigenous, by the colonialism, you do see that there is now about 1.8 million Nahuatl speakers. And the numbers have continued to rise. Obviously, they're not at the numbers where they should be, but that adaptation is remarkable. And I think that right now that there is a moment in Mexico where we are more embracing of our indigenous ancestry. And I think this started with the fact how it takes time, of course. And I think that there needs to be some recognition. But the thing is that in my experience, I really haven't come across too many people who are like proud of like this European heritage. I think that over time, and I think because of the 1940s, during Mexico's golden age of cinema, we started to embrace the fact that we are Mexicans, that we don't say that we're Latinos or we say we're Hispanics. We say that we're Mexican first. Hispanic and Latinos are not even, that's labels not even used in Mexico. So we start saying that we're Mexican and we start embracing these terms and we start focusing on our own community, I think. And so I think recently, like when Vicente Fox administration started recognize that the indigenous languages of Mexico are national languages at the same level as Spanish, that helps people realize that, hey, we got to start promoting. There's still a lot of work to do, but we need to see that this is part of us. This is part of our culture. And I would be the first to say it's our foundation. Yes, we have European influence, but this goes back to like my identity. What do I know about Spain? I've never been there. I don't have a relative that's from there. That wasn't passed on to me. I am more closer to my indigenous ancestry because I live in Mexico where there is the indigenous culture that's here. Spain's on the other side of the world. And I think there's people who tend to not understand that you have to kind of break away from that is that, yes, you can be proud to be Spanish, but you're not a Spaniard that is from Spain. There's a lot of people who claim like they're Spanish ancestry and they're different from being indigenous, but in the end of the day, you still have the same, you're still mixed. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because of that. People have these ideologies of that superiority complex that, oh, I'm Spanish, which is more seen as higher, like that. And I think that that is one of the issues that has occurred. But I think that overall, Mexico has shifted into a mestizo society, but we are still we are appreciating we appreciate more of our indigenous ancestry now, and especially in places that are more outside of where the European influence is at, in a sense. And it's complex because you can take plenty of different examples because there people think like this these different ways throughout the country. But it seems like in my experience, when I go to certain parts of Mexico, people don't really care about their European ancestry. So like I've been to Sonora or Sinaloa, people don't care about it. You know, you go to Puebla, depending on what community you're at, you know, it's interesting. You mean, of course, you go to some areas where there's the Europeans and they want to bring that up. So that's a whole other conversation to have. But I think what's important is that over time, Mexico and Mexicans have promoted themselves as Mexicans as like their nationality first. But yeah, that's a whole other conversation to get into. But
Some of what you're talking about here is Anibal Quijano's decolonial theory. And so here, especially when we're talking about reclaiming identity, right? And how what that looks like today. For me, that looks like IRP because we've got stories passed down for generations. We've got stories that are resilient through statelessness, diaspora, stories of genocides. Stories are what are really a huge part, and dating back to that 90,000 years ago Blombos Cave and what we could say some of the first indigenous people that we can have evidence for. We think about what was communicated about around fires for tens of thousands of years, and it's our stories. Humans, we have connection, we have stories, we want to know each other and learn from each other and help each other. And so reclaiming those stories, that's where, you know, it's one thing to kill my grandfather. It's a different thing to tell me who he was.
yes,
Whenever we think about decolonizing in the modern system, land rights, that's a tough one. That takes time. Stopping genocide, also a very tough one, super dangerous. We think about some of these bigger challenges. Stopping the loss of language when you have migrations happening from multiple different areas to multiple different areas on a global scale. All of these are major challenges, but what we need to do is bring attention to them with our ears by listening to indigenous peoples themselves and
correct.
and recognizing that the way in which they tell their story is a part of that decolonization process and is a part of the lesson that we can learn when we listen.
Yep. I agree with that. And I think that sometimes we are very well, I'm just generalizing the general population here, is that I feel that people are too quick to assume things, you know, and like I said, I'm not expecting everybody to have the same experience as us, but be more open to hearing from academics, from people that have experience, people from these communities. Because I think that when you try to shut people down or you try to think that you know it all, you are creating the issue itself that continues to push or devalue the contributions of indigenous people. And so I think that we have a lot of perspectives to talk about this. I mean, I see in North America, we live as a European centric mindset because they're the ones that have conquered the lands, right? So when does it come a time when the indigenous people say that, well, we've been here before, and this is our contributions to this nation? And I think it's more difficult for people from the United States because the indigenous populations from the United States because they had less population than Mexico because Mexico had the full scale civilization, so they had the foundation. You know, so it's difficult to address this all the time. I think some countries are at a higher advantage than others. And I think that that is something that everybody should come to understand that you have to work with these cultures and understand their histories to appreciate their contributions to society.
And hopefully more and hopefully more as far as support indigenous communities because you understand their value in our global heritage in that quilt, but also because yeah, one thing I probably didn't really hit on, but and I'm not. Let's say we can even exclude myself from this conversation. Not to say I'm wise, but I believe that indigenous communities have wisdom,
Oh yeah.
and that wisdom is built not. I mean, we're talking not even back to colonialism or imperialism or the age of exploration or keep going even before Christ for many. indigenous communities dating back centuries and millennia. So just remembering that cultures that have been around that long didn't stick around for that many generations without a few good lessons on how to be a human. So I think that yeah, listening and helping to make a difference in the challenges that are being faced, because the reality is that yes, um, we can tell stories, we can talk about identity, we can claim identity, uh, but ultimately, if we don't calibrate our systems to allow the space and the representation and the resources for indigenous communities not to assimilate into what the modern world expects, but instead to maintain their own traditions. If we don't do that, if we don't make that time and space and effort, then we will lose colors of our global heritage quilt that we will all be ashamed of, and who knows what else is lost with that, as I was
Oh,
speaking.
absolutely. And I think
Topic.
you touched it right there. This is our global heritage.
Yeah.
That means that this is part of all of our history as a human species.
Yes.
And we forget that because we think that it doesn't affect us or that because it's from somewhere else. But instead of realizing it can happen to you, it can happen to your own culture. So why are we wanting to separate, or why do we want to ignore this? Or why can't we just at least put some recognition of the struggles of other people that they're going through? But all right, I think that we pretty much covered our topics unless there's anything else you want to mention
No,
in there.
that was
I'm
a
sure
lot
that
of
there's
fun.
plenty of things that people are viewing this can go ahead and comment, and if they have any things that we need to talk about, because we're sure we missed a lot of things, and maybe there's some how we can interpret things, or like if we how we said things, maybe they need some um
Oh
re-
yeah, great point, Jonathan. Any wording that we might have used on any of these sensitive topics that somebody would like to provide some feedback on, we're open. I think that we are both pretty conscientious about how we speak and about these topics, and we do our best. And of course, we will never make everyone happy, but we're always lifetime learners and are open to listen.
Absolutely. And yeah, so if anybody has any questions on that, follow below, and any questions related to what we've covered, or if we need to rehash what we said, then we'll be open to that. So please go ahead and leave a comment in there, and we'll try to get back to you guys on that. I'd like to thank Sam for joining me, and I look forward for us both to work together in the future.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Okay, there's a recording.